So grand a building he would never have laid his eyes on. Years in rushed huts and dense forests had always suited him more. He'd likely have grown more accustomed to the huge marbled columns and the strange dress of the Romans as the weeks had passed. But still Caratacus, king of the once mighty and proud Catilavani, likely wouldn't have had the resolve to hide his hatred of the legionaries marching beside him. Their tight formation and rigid organisation made them seem more like insects than men. No brain of their own, just a part of a larger organism with a singular motive, serving their queen, or in this case Emperata. How these men lived with such a lack of pride and individual thought was surely a puzzling concept to a warrior king like Caratacus. How their gods must value such degradation of the soul would have been beyond him. Caratacus would no doubt have reflected on how he had reached this place, the centrepiece of a military force never before seen on Earth, and how the Roman wart had grown over his lands and corrupted its peoples. Nearly a decade of resistance had led him here, an audience with the most powerful man in the world. So much they had, so opulent their city and their garb, the size of their monuments, the quality of their arms, and yet they scoured to the corners of the world for more, robbing men of their lands and free will, a destiny sure to leave these Romans unfulfilled and wanting. Conquest they desired above all else, and the glory and wealth associated with it, their names to be remembered alongside the very gods they worshipped. If that is their desire, that is their addiction, their flaw, their vice, then the great stallion will appease this harangue of dogs and stroke their desire to glorify their actions. His life was in the gods' hands, that much at least had not changed, not in these 10 years of resistance. Before he gave what would likely be the final address of his life, his mind wandered back to where all this had begun. The embers of the past is a passion to bring history to life. Caratacus and his struggles were as real as you or I, and so is his story, his resistance, and his meeting with Emperor Claudius. My mind, however, is responsible for conveying Caratacus's potential thoughts in the previous passage, an attempt at painting a brief scene in a history I wish to bring to life. The art of storytelling and history are loves I share an equal passion with, and the reason for this channel. The true style I wish to conceive and what blend of narratives I wish to use are still subjects I am experimenting with. For now though, I hope you enjoy the history of one of the great kings of the Catilavani tribe in ancient Britain, Caratacus. The world of pre-Roman Britain is a world of mystery and intrigue. Those peoples that inhabited the island were no less fortunate than their continental cousins in abating the great wildfire of Roman conquest. Not even the English Channel could act as a firebreak. The flames licked almost every corner of the land. The history of how this conquest took place, the clash of cultures and the tribal world this story took place in are part of an incredibly rich and thickly woven tapestry. But less attention is often paid to this area of history than is deserved. And likewise the characters from Britain's ancient past are neglected equally. Caratacus is a symbol of resistance, defiance, that tale as old as time of oppressor versus oppressed, conqueror versus defender. We know of William Wallace or Joan of Arc, but many of Britain's heroes remain neglected. Caratacus, or loving beloved dear friend, was not only a king of the Catilavani tribe, or the war chiefs, but he also united disparate peoples and crossed tribal lines. His resistance to Roman conquest lasted almost a decade, and his story is one of honour, resistance and betrayal. The life within ancient Britain is one we know little about. The sources are near non-existent, and those we do have are Roman. Not only is this a problem for the obvious reasons of lacking a deeper understanding of who the Britons were, but it also has the potential to give a warped perspective of what we do know. The Roman perspective of these peoples was of brutality and barbarity, but the truth is obviously far more nuanced. How do we expect the victor to paint a fair picture of the enemy they wish to or have subjugated? How do we gain a deeper understanding of a culture when those recording the history do not even recognise the culture as truly having a right to exist? Every nuance and detail will be lost in the broad strokes of mass categorization, pacification, or extermination. The tribes of Britain I sometimes let myself imagine to be like those of the Native Americans before the Europeans arrived. Vast arrays of connected and different peoples, isolated from the world, or at least to an extent in the Britons' case. But isolation is always temporary. Just as in the Native Americans' case, the powers that have the will and strength to do so will always look to expand their kingdoms. The Britons could not escape the behemoth of their age. Rome's shadow was one that defied the very laws of nature. It stretched far and wide in every direction it dared, from Spain to Syria and Egypt to Germany. The Roman eagle would first land on British soil with the arrival of Julius Caesar in 55 and 54 BC. On Caesar's second visit to the island, the great gods of fate were already laying the groundwork for our story. Caesar would march deep into Catalavani territory, what is now Hertfordshire, Bedfordshire, Buckinghamshire, and southern Cambridgeshire. Here Caesar would do as the Romans did, force capitulation. The king who led the resistance was a man named Cassivellaunus, thought to be the king of the Catalavani. He had been expanding his territories at the expense of neighbouring tribes like the Trinovantes, although again, gaining a true understanding of how these tribal relationships manifested themselves is almost impossible. But already the war chiefs or the Catalavani were showing themselves as those most willing to face this foreign Roman invader, even if for now they would fail. It seems Caratacus' later resistance in almost 100 years was something maybe not just embedded within his people, but maybe even running through his veins. The Catalavani were clearly a threat to their neighbours and the Romans. The Trinovantes, those people east of the Catalavani and south of Boudicca's Iceni, would ally with Caesar and request protection from the encroaching Catalavani. It is shown through coins minted in the Trinovantes' territory that at multiple points the Catalavani had encroached into and captured parts of their kingdom. Throughout their history, the Catalavani seem to expand at their neighbours' expense on multiple occasions. In Caesar's commentaries on the Gallic War, he mentions the fact that the king of the Trinovantes, Mandubratius, had come to Caesar while he was in Gaul and pledged loyalty, requesting protection from the Catalavani who were invading his lands. His father, Amentius, had already died at Cassivellaunus' hand. After the Romans had exacted tribute and made their presence felt in the country, they would once more cross the channel and head back into Gaul within 54 BC. Caesar had claimed the title as the first Roman to cross into Britain with an army, let alone fight and defeat those most barbaric natives on the edge of the world. At least the stories would greatly increase his prestige if he gained little else. The next 90 years would be a time of increased trade and Romanization. Kings would now mint coins in the Roman style and with Latin script. They would title themselves Rex, and those most loyal to Rome would gain the most favour and the title of client king. It seems just like the Catalavani had forced native kings to seek aid from Caesar in 54 BC, they would do the same in Claudius's reign and force the Roman allies, the Atrebate, out of their northern kingdoms around Silchester around 40 AD. Verica, king of the Atrebates, a Belgic tribe from Gaul who held territories within Britain, would flee to seek aid from Claudius. Once again, the Catalavani would show their clear love for war and their domination over the region, capturing and exiling kings from neighbouring tribes. This is where our story truly begins. The Britons had not forgotten the ease with which the Romans had exacted tribute during Caesar's visit in 54 BC, and that was with a small force of soldiers, with almost no cavalry. The evolution from republic to empire, and the troubles that took place during Rome's subsequent civil wars, managed to give the Celts and Britons some reprieve. But while some remained allied with Rome, and others broke treaties that had been set in place, it seems that in the 90 years the Romans had been gone, the British tribes were once more operating in their independent manner, and the fear that the Romans had injected into the island had slowly subsided, although had not been forgotten altogether. The tribes would no doubt have been aware of Claudius's imminent arrival. Many Belgic tribes had crossed into Britain before Caesar's invasion in 54 BC, and established themselves in the southeast of the island. But still they had deep cultural and trade links to the continent that would have informed them of the emperor's plans. The exact location of Claudius's landing is not known. It was most likely Richmond in Kent, but some historians hypothesize that they may have landed on the south banks around Chichester, within Atrebate territory, for after all it was Verica, king of the Atrebate, who had sought help from Claudius after Caratacus had forced him from his kingdom. It is generally agreed the landing was likely in Richmond though. It is worth mentioning quickly that much of the history that we know that took place between Caesar's and Claudius's invasion is based on coinage. This is possibly the most important evidence in all of this period of pre-Roman Britain. It often tells us where coins were minted and who minted them. It also gives us a rough idea of how these borders and territories changed over the decades. There is very little doubt that the Catalavani were the dominant force in the southeast and the Thames Valley region, as shown by the spread of their coinage and where they were minting them, and the obvious fact of them expelling multiple kings from their lands. Caratacus knew the Romans would move swiftly and pressure the local tribes into capitulation. He had to act fast. forming an alliance of those he knew still had the might to resist and had not been corrupted by Roman gold. The Roman disease would no doubt head west and straight inland. The eastern areas of Kent were still bog-ridden swamps at this time, and the rivers were far larger and wider than we see in the modern day, forming vast areas of low-lying bogs. It would not be until the Victorian era when lots of these lands would be drained completely and cleared for agricultural use. Many of the paths and routes through the country were prehistoric and would not be recognised as the paths that we walk today. The coastline was clearly different, and so was the land. Caratacus needed a natural barrier in order to mount his defence. The rivers were that perfect barrier. But Rome always had new tricks up their sleeve. It seems the strategy of the Britons was to first slow down the Romans and stop them from widely and freely foraging and travelling, much like they had done during Caesar's time. This was on one hand to avoid the pitched battles they knew the Romans favoured, but also to give time for tribes far and wide to send warriors to this great battle for Britain. It is estimated Rome had a total force of 40,000 men, including auxiliaries, slaves and camp followers. The British force was no doubt far larger, with some estimates reaching over 100,000 fighting men. After some brief skirmishes, the British force would set up a large camp next to the River Medway. Such crossings as rivers and large forests were easy barriers to take advantage of, and in most cases would have given armies of the time period and location some serious strategic issues. The Romans were not like anyone of their age or this region, though. I will now go to Cassius Dio for his account of how this first major encounter was to play out. Plautius, accordingly, had a deal of trouble in searching them out, but when at last he did find them, he first defeated Caratacus and then Togodumnus, the sons of Cunobelinus, who was dead. The Britons were not free and independent, but were divided into groups under various kings. After the flight of these kings, he gained by capitulation a part of the Boduni, who were ruled by a tribe of the Catalavani, and leaving a garrison there, he advanced further and came to a river. The barbarians thought that Romans would not be able to cross it without a bridge, and consequently bivouacked in rather careless fashion on the opposite bank. But he sent across a detachment of Germans, who were accustomed to swim easily in full armour across the turbulent streams. These fell unexpectedly upon the enemy, but instead of shooting at any of the men, they confined themselves to wounding the horses that drew their chariots, and in the confusion that followed, not even the enemy's mounted warriors could save themselves. Plautius thereupon sent across Flavius Vespasian, also the man who afterwards became emperor, and his brother Sabinus, who was acting as his lieutenant. So they too got across the river in some way and killed many of the foe, taking them by surprise. The survivors, however, did not take flight, but on the next day joined issue with them again. The struggle was indecisive until Gnaeus Horcidius Geta, after narrowly missing being captured, finally managed to defeat the barbarians so soundly that he received the Ornamentia Triumphalia, though he had not been consul. Thence the Britons retired to the River Thames at a point near where it empties into the ocean, and at flood tide forms a lake. This they easily crossed because they knew where the firm ground and the easy passage in this region were to be found, but the Romans, in attempting to follow them, were not so successful. However, the Germans swam across again, and some others got over by a bridge a little way upstream, after which they assailed the barbarians from several sides at once and cut down many of them. In pursuing the remainder incautiously, they got into swamps from which it was difficult to make their way out, and so lost a number of men." End quote. This was another special power the Romans possessed. Due to their huge empire and vast array of auxiliary legionaries from across the world, they had a huge variety of specialist units. These men, described as being able to cross rivers well dressed in their complete armour, not only baffled the Britons, but also many others in Roman history. It is thought these men were Batavians, a famous tribe if you are aware of the history of Rome. They would not only make up a part of the emperor's personal bodyguard, but were also responsible for a famous rebellion in Rome's early empire. Their knowledge of and natural inclination towards water was one that made them a most fearsome foe. After this battle, and another subsequent one at the Thames, the Britons would disperse. The Romans had once more displayed why they were a force to be feared, and continued their march northwards towards the heart of the Catalavani territory. 11 British kings had capitulated, and Caratacus' brother was now dead. It then seems the Romans slowed their advance, and sent for the emperor. With a victory in sight, the presence of Claudius was vital to ensure that he was credited fully with this great victory over these savages on the edge of the world. The weight this would add to Claudius' legacy and his prestige in Rome was unquestionable. Claudius would arrive within a few weeks of the messages being sent out, and reportedly would take war elephants on the voyage across the channel. If true, no doubt adding to this otherworldly aura the Romans must have seemed to possess. What would a Celtic tribesman think seeing such animals ridden through their lands? It is an unimaginable thought to the modern mind. We are blessed with the knowledge of creatures great and small from every corner of the globe. The ancient Celts did not have such a luxury, and the sights of such beasts must have terrified them. Upon Claudius's arrival, the Romans would march on the main Catilavani capital at Colchester, or Camulodunum, what was once the heart of the Trinovantes territory, with the other Catilavani capital being St. Albans. With this conquest and British capitulation, Colchester would become the first Roman-British colonia or fortified outpost. This was far enough north to ensure these eastern tribes would not quickly think to rebel, but not so far north that it was likely to become a target for those tribes still not under Rome's rule. After this submission, Rome had now effectively annexed a large portion of southern Britain and had sworn loyalties and taken hostages from the rest of the kings in the south. It seems Catilavane territory may have stretched all the way to the west country to one side and to the coast in the east. Now Rome had put an end to this powerful tribe, and they would fall into line. Caratacus, on the other hand, was not going to give in quite so easily. Caratacus would continue his fight though, and it is thought he would move into Wales to continue his resistance, which was and continued to be a hotbed of anti-Roman sentiment. Caratacus would ally with the Silures and Orvices, two tribes located in modern-day eastern and northern Wales. The Silures would be a constant pain in the side of Roman expansion and were known for their style of hit-and-run guerrilla warfare. They were one of the last tribes in the region to capitulate to Roman rule and were highly respected. This is where Caratacus found his home. Wales was truly the heart of Celtic culture, further away from the English Channel, and the population here was likely to have resided on the island for longer than their Belgic cousins. Caratacus at this point was raised above all other Britons in their admiration for his resistance against Rome. His own homes had been destroyed and his people subjugated, but unlike the Trinovantes, Cante or Danubi, he would continue to resist. The exact timeline is murky, but by 50 AD, Roman general Publius Ostorius Scapula had moved into Wales and was pacifying the southern territories of the Silures with a project of fort building. He would also cut off the Welsh tribes from the English tribes in the north and trap them within their borders. Caratacus would continue to wage guerrilla warfare and flee further north to the Ordovice as the Silures were slowly cut off. His potential alliances slowly were methodically being destroyed, and the Roman expansion continued. In the limestone-laden hills and steep crevices of Wales, Caratacus would mount his last stand, creating ramparts at the top of hills and using large rocks to disorganize the potential for the Roman advance. They entrenched and prepared themselves. This battle would fare no more favourably though, and Caratacus' family would be captured and taken hostage. Although we are moving quickly through this period due to the lack of sources, the resistance was not just pushed aside. There are pits found in the region dating from the invasion with over 1,000 dead Britons in them, and the skeletons with snapped spines where ballista projectiles had been launched at great speeds over the walls of hill forts and into the ranks of men. The carnage would have been an ungodly sight, and the Britons did not just lie down and give in. Historians today still dispute where Caratacus' final stand was, though. With his family now in chains, his spirit was still not broken. He would now move with the few loyal followers he had left northwards and seek aid from the Queen of the Brigantes, Cartamandua, a tribe located in modern-day Yorkshire. Unfortunately, though, the brave resistance mounted by Caratacus was not one that was matched by all of his fellow Celts. No, unfortunately for Caratacus, this queen knew the way the tide was turning, and was already closely allied with Rome. Instead of helping the resistance fight on, she would inform the Romans that the leader of the British resistance was now in her custody. Maybe due to these actions, the Brigantes would soon suffer a civil war, but for now, the Romans would arrive in her territories and claim their prize. Caratacus would be transported back to Rome to be the centrepiece in a triumph over these apparent barbarians on the edge of the known world. Just another savage set to be brutally murdered in front of a crowd of civilized Romans. With this great king defeated, Britain would fall quiet until the great revolt of Boudicca and the Iceni, killing up to 10,000 Romans just over a decade later. What if the Britons had been united? What if the Iceni had not waited decades to aid in the resistance, but had united with their cultural kin? How would history have looked? What if the Brigantes did not like Roman gold so much? What would a Roman conquest have looked like if they had been met by hundreds of thousands of men and women, organised in a combined resistance, not a patchwork of deep rivalries and self-promoting motives. But alas, as many what-ifs as we could ask, the resistance had been crushed for now, and Caratacus would find himself sat within a dungeon in Rome. But once he had reached the Eternal City, he would be given the chance to show what a true British Celtic king looked like, and he would not waste such an opportunity. These Romans were great in battle and even better at politics, but their self-aggrandizing and love of themselves was clear. Every man has his vice. The Romans was their pride. Stroking an ego is far easier than taming a wild horse or taking the life of a true warrior. Any fool can take part in such an act. Days before he was to meet his fate, slaves came to him in his dungeon, wiping the filth from him and bathing him, cleaning his hair and feeding him well. It was through no love for the great Catalavane king, but to return him to his visual glory. The Romans wished not to see a bedraggled, broken man. To conquer such a species was hardly impressive. No, the Romans desired him to stand in all his glory, a sign of the great power the Romans had overcome, and the far corners of the world they ruled over. After the great triumph, Caratacus was placed in front of the Emperor Claudius and the Senate, and as history records it, his words and his mind were the most impressive of all, dispelling such Roman notions of these men being mindless brutes. As he stepped forward with his head held high and his eyes defiantly returning the gaze of the great Romans in his presence, and seemingly not out of place, but giving a speech to his friends and comrades back in the heart of Catalavani territory, his presence was the largest in the great room, and his deep voice echoed amongst the great domed ceiling. He spoke as follows: "Had my moderation and prosperity been equal to my noble birth and fortune, I should have entered this city as your friend rather than as your captive, and you would not have disdained to receive under a treaty of peace a king descended from illustrious ancestors and ruling many nations. My present lot is as glorious to you as it is degrading to myself. I had men and horses, arms and wealth. What wonder if I parted with them reluctantly? If you Romans choose to lord it over the world, does it follow that the world is to accept slavery? Were I to have been at once delivered up as a prisoner, neither my fall nor your triumph would have become famous. My punishment would be followed by oblivion, whereas if you save my life, I shall be an everlasting memorial of your clemency." He stepped back into the ranks of his family. He had now spoken with dignity and honour, but his words served his purpose. With this, Claudius and the Senate, equally impressed by the quality of the language as the sentiments embedded within, pardoned Caratacus and his family, retiring them to a villa within the boundaries of Rome and giving them a monthly allowance to live by. For all he had seen, all he had done, and the change in the world his eyes had witnessed, no king was more deserving of the clemency offered by Rome. As legend goes, he lived out the rest of his life in peace within the protection of the empire, a symbol of those great peoples that still could not overcome the might of the eagle. After Caratacus' capture, more revolts would spring up within Britain, not just in the form of Boudica. The Brigantes would eventually revolt, and the Silures would continue to cause major issues, catching fort-building parties and massacring them shortly after Caratacus' capture, a sign of their disgust at the loss of their improvised leader and the resistance they intended to continue. Britain, being on the edge of the world, would continue to be a hotspot for resistance. Ireland and Scotland were never truly pacified, and Wales continued to be a launching pad for anti-Roman incursions. The Celts, their culture, their arts and their way of life are one of the most misunderstood aspects of history. Once I've gone over some more of these Celtic tribes, I plan on delving more into their religious and artistic inclinations, the great legends associated with them, and the continued clash of cultures on the island of Britain. This has been the tale of Caratacus. I'm sorry there was such a lack of detail in some areas. This is why these portions of history are much less reported on than many other areas of the empire. It truly is a lot harder to discover and compile sources and a story when dealing with these dark corners of the world. Please do like, comment and subscribe if you enjoyed the video or gained anything from it. I plan on creating a library associated with ancient Britain and the Celtic tribes, so if you are so inclined, please do follow the channel. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch the video, and goodbye.